gonna give them a vision of the world the way it really is.
Welcome. My name is Ken LaCorte. I was a longtime executive at Fox News Channel. I am here with my former boss at Fox News, John Moody, who basically established all of the news division there and ran it for a decade and a half. We have just finished watching Showtime's Loudest Voice, and we're here to give you some of our thoughts on what was right, what's wrong, and maybe some of the stories they missed. So, John, let's start with you. You saw it. What were your first impressions?
Ken, let's start with the good parts. I mean, it was wonderfully acted. I think that the actors themselves did very well. They were convincing. They were easy to watch, and you began to feel something for each one of them, whether it was good or bad, by the end of the first episode.
Yeah, it was tough. That opening scene is Roger Ailes dead on the floor.
Well, I guess that was how Showtime wanted to start with a happy beginning, because.
Well, it was tough to watch. I mean, I'd been in that bathroom 2 weeks before I know what had happened, and it was just kind of it was a tough scene to open. So they open with that. They go to Roger talking about that he's conservative, he eats a lot, and then he's going through a plate of pancakes and bacon and making sure that the waitress doesn't tell him what'd she say? She said happy. She said something happy holidays, not Merry Christmas. So the first real big scene, though, was him meeting with Jack Welch, chairman of GE, getting fired from CNBC. Now, this was right before you came into his orbit. Did you know him at CNBC, or what was?
No, I never did. No.
Okay, so Jack Welch is still alive. We don't know if that scene was what was right and what was wrong in that scene. We do know that they gave him a non-compete, and Roger signed a non-compete that said he wouldn't go over to any present news channel. And a few weeks later, he was standing next to Rupert Murdoch announcing the takeover of the Fox News Channel.
I mean, pun intended, he outfoxed Jack. And after Jack Welch left GE, he was actually a frequent visitor over at Fox News Channel. He'd be on a business show, and he always came up to Roger's office either before or after his hits on screen. And I was in the office once when he was there, and he very candidly said, Roger, letting you go was the biggest mistake of my career.
Yeah, it probably cost him billions of dollars, and they understood that. So he was at CNBC for a couple years, and then they went to the scene, and I actually think that that the next scene was more realistic in the movie than it was in Gabe Sherman's book, and it was basically Roger saying goodbye to his staff at CNBC. So this is based on a book by Gabe Sherman, and we'll be talking a lot about him as we move on, because John and I have both had a little bit of interaction with him, called The Loudest Voice in the Room, because Fox was just loud and blustery and not smart or anything like that.
As was Roger.
Yes, everybody was screaming. And it was interesting because when you read that part of the book, if you read about his CNBC years, you kind of it felt like reading 1984. You had this kind of dystopian, Roger always yelling, and everybody was cowed into existence, and everybody was miserable there. And then when he left, 100 people from CNBC came over to Fox with him. I mean, Roger, go ahead.
He once said that NBC had threatened to sue him for poaching its employees. And he said, I wasn't poaching them, that was a jailbreak.
And it was so that was kind of there was a little bit of a disconcerting notion between Sherman's book about how everybody was miserable at CNBC, yet so many of the people came over, and the core team, many of the people on the core team came over from CNBC. So John, the next scene then we had was he and Rupert making the announcement of Fox News Channel. At what point did you get involved in this? Because I came in about maybe a year and a half later. You were there from pre-launch. How did that happen?
Yeah, I was there from pre-launch, and I did see one of the press conferences that he and Rupert gave. And The questioning was harsh, a harbinger of things to come. The press just didn't believe that this could happen, and Roger handled it all with charm and humor, and a little bit of bite back. Somebody asked him, "Well, how can you possibly compete?" And he said, "Yeah, what network are you with?" He said, "Oh, yeah," and so he gave as good as he got, and that was going to be his trademark all the time with the press.
I remember, I forget if it was the New York Times, who talked about Rupert's invisible friend.
Rupert's imaginary friend.
Rupert's imaginary friend, talking about how he, was basically facing something that was
right.
too much.
Of course, Ted Turner, the owner of CNN, promised, "I'm going to squish Rupert like a bug," and that didn't quite happen.
Right. So then there was one scene which I suppose was just for expediency, but it was a bunch of executives and Rupert, and the executives were saying we're going to be kind of this broad-based national news channel, the whole world's going to be our audience, and Roger was like, yeah, screw that, it's going to be conservatives, and Rupert was like, oh, hey, that's a good idea. I kind of had the sense that when Rupert Murdoch decided to spend $1 billion on a new channel, he figured out who to market it towards.
Of course, and that's where you're seeing TV instead of reality. I remember that woman that supposedly was outlining the future for us. What she actually said at the meeting was, "There's no way you can compete with CNN. They are a household name. They're the generic product, and anything you do is going to be doomed to failure." That was a really jolly meeting.
Wow. How did that end? And how much was similar to what we saw on the show?
It was nothing like what we saw on the show. Chet Collier brought this woman in. I think he had some affiliation with her in the past. And Roger sat there very, very quiet and listened to it all and said, "Thank you very much for your time." I mean, there was none of this, we're going to be conservative. We're going to no. He was much too refined a mind for that kind of action. And the part where Ian Ray is presenting a blueprint or a business plan for Rupert's consideration, that never happened.
So let's go through some of the characters. Let's end with Roger. Let's start with Rupert. The actor on Rupert kind of got a little bit of his mannerisms.
He did a great job.
What did you think he captured? What did you think he failed on that so far? I mean, we're one episode in.
The fact that Rupert Murdoch, billionaire and mogul that he was, also had a human side to him. And though he would occasionally have temper tantrums, his interactions with Roger were always, at least when I was around, very polite and almost on a basis of equality. Rupert did not pound his fists and say, "If you do this, mate, I'm going to have to make a move." No, that's just not the way he did things.
That was the thing that jumped out with me. So I was in maybe 50 to 100 meetings with Rupert Murdoch, and whatever the opposite of the word unflappable is, I mean, he was unflappable. He was. Somebody said, "How do you describe once those two men, Rupert Murdoch and Roger Ailes?" And I said, if somebody came in the room and said, "There's a meteor heading for Earth. Scientists have reported it. We're all going to be dead in 20 minutes." Rupert would have been like, "Yeah, well, we'll see, mate."
Yeah, exactly.
And he would have moved on, and he would have finished the meeting. Roger, his first notion would have been, "Why is there a meteor coming for me?" Because
and do we have a camera on it? Yeah.
And do we have a camera on it? But then we would have all been racing to the basement. He would have been we would have been going to a subway station, and he would have been doing his very best right up until minute 20 on how are we going to save this? How are we going to turn this around? How are we going to stop this? And that was the kind of guy Roger was. It was from the, the world, his world revolved around him, and as it did both in his head and largely in reality. But yeah, no, he would have gone down without fighting. Rupert would have been like, "Yeah, maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong." I'll never forget when somebody in one of our meetings came in and was like, "They're starting a new conservative channel and blah, blah, blah." He was like, "We'll see." When you could understand Rupert. I mean, God love him. He created this thing. He gave me the job. But a third of the time when he was talking with his accent and his low volume, I had no idea what the hell he was saying. I mean, did you have that problem?
It was a learned ability. It did not come naturally.
I remember,
But you know what, Ken? Everything that Rupert said was based on knowledge of things and what he knew was going to happen, and we didn't know yet. And he
That's very true.
You remember these meetings where, God forbid, you should tell him something he already knew.
Well, I found Rupert Murdoch to be a savant when it came to numbers. And God bless the poor guy who had to run the Fox Business Channel. Brian would give the numbers. Oh, and the GDP of France was 18.3, and Rupert would be like 18.26. He just said under his breath. And I think he saw numbers the way that they just stuck in his head. I remember one time I was wrong on how many miles somebody shot. It was a long distance sniper shot in the Gulf War, and he was like, no, it was 3.2. And I was like, fuck, you're right. Sorry. He's 89 years old or however old he was, and he was correcting us up one side and down the other.
And I'll bet you very strongly that he didn't watch this show.
Yeah, I remember one time when Roger was, and we'll talk more about Gabe Sherman as we move on. Roger was always very concerned about his image, and they wrote an article about him, and we'd have meetings on that kind of thing. And Rupert said, "Well, Roger, just don't read them." And he literally, there were books about Rupert Murdoch that Rupert Murdoch, I believe in my heart, hasn't read. He said he hasn't read them, and everybody kind of says shit like that, but I believe Rupert on that.
His stock phrase was, "It goes with the territory."
Yeah, I guess when your wife's Jerry Hall, you're worth billions of dollars, your kids are healthy, some little asshole writing about you in the newspaper doesn't really bother you.
He's right. It goes with the territory.
Anything else on Rupert as a character on here? I felt the guy, except for he was a little too quick and a little too flappable, I felt that the actor kind of nailed him down pretty good.
I think the important point in the dynamic between Rupert and Roger, which did not appear in this program, Roger at one point said to Rupert, "Get these people out of my way." And it wasn't just other employees. It wasn't just Ian Ray and things like that. It was, don't tell me how to build the studio. Don't tell me how many square meters it has to be. Don't tell me who to hire and who not. He wanted control of the thing. He knew what he wanted to do, and he couldn't have the corporate bureaucracy of News Corporation getting in his way at every trick and turn, because a lot of them didn't like him. And he had to come to terms with Rupert on that.
I remember Roger saying that he asked Rupert to watch his back. And Rupert and Roger's telling Rupert was like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Well, you've had, 3 other presidents of Fox News, and they haven't gone on the air yet, so it wasn't anybody on the outside killing them, it was guys on the inside killing them, because there was a lot of corporate politics where they were," so he was just like, "Keep all those sons of bitches off of me, and that can be one of your biggest jobs, to help me out and let me build this thing." And I think to Rupert's credit, he did, because the guys, the Fox guys in Hollywood didn't want this to be successful. A lot of guys thought it was a waste of money. Nobody there weren't a whole lot of guys in Hollywood saying, "Gee, maybe a conservative news channel will help our image here." So, I do recall.
Yeah, and one of the things he said, I think, in the show was, just get me the eyeballs. Just get potential viewers.
Now, by that, what did he mean? Because they said that in the show, and most people probably didn't understand it.
Right. Well, on cable, you have to have carriage by some carrier, whether it's DirecTV or Verizon, or I don't even know all the companies. But, and again, there was going to be this built-in resistance to any kind of Murdoch-led network, and read that as right-leaning network, and that was really going to be a killer if we didn't find some eyeballs.
So
and Roger, and most important, at least to Rupert, was he wanted to be on in New York City, and we waited for weeks and months trying to find out if we can possibly get on Time Warner Cable, which was then the predominant cable carrier in New York City. Well, guess what network Time Warner owned? CNN. Why were they going to help us? And, to his immense credit, Roger went up and had a meeting with Rupert and came back down, and he said, "I think we're going to be on in New York by launch time." And I said, "Really, Roger? I mean, how's that going to happen?" And he said, "We do know the mayor." And the mayor at that time was Rudy Giuliani, who's Roger had helped in an election campaign.
So I had worked on that campaign for Roger. I had actually, one of the most uncomfortable parts of my life one time was when I was debating Rudy Giuliani. And this is in Roger's studio in New York. This is the 1989, his failed mayoral campaign against David Dinkins. And Rudy ate me up. It was like debating a boxer. You'd start talking and he'd talk right over you and just verbally just slap you up, and you're just like, it was an interesting time. I also remember that Rudy's son, who was the little precocious kid who he's probably 40 now, but he had somehow locked me, Roger, and Rudy Giuliani in Roger's studio. Locked it, and the doorknob came off. So like we literally couldn't get out of the studio until they had to bring somebody with screwdrivers and whatnot. Anyhow. Probably one of the things, though, that helped Fox News was that they were off for the first month or so in New York. There was this huge fight. Rudy came to he was going to put them on. He was going to put Fox on one of the two channels that were slated for just New York City. Time Warner gave two channels to New York, and then Time came back and said, no. That part of the deal is that there are no ads on that. And Roger and you guys were like, fine, we won't put ads on the New York City feed. And then finally they were like, okay. So, I mean, you got to build up. First of all, you got to have, look, this is our first video here, so we're going to suck in so many ways that we won't suck in 2 months. Fox News sucked in its first, its first days and weeks, and it was off of New York, built up this anticipation, and then we're able to pop on there.
Yeah.
Okay, so another, to me, one of the most scarily accurate, at least as far as mannerisms and looks, was Beth Ailes. I'm a big fan of Beth. I don't know. I mean, there were so many conversations between Roger Ailes and Beth Ailes. Beth wasn't talking, Roger's gone, so I don't know. So that has to be pure fiction. So there's no chance any Hollywood writer could figure that one out. But the actress, her mannerisms, there was a good that was, to me, that was pretty spot on accurate. Again, just stylistic wise. Your thoughts?
I've seen Sienna Miller in other productions. Nothing as good as this.
Yeah, no, I thought she really hit that, and I'm sure we'll see a lot more of Beth's character. I have to say though, this screenplay was written on a book and by Gabe Sherman, who really didn't like Roger, and Roger hated him. And it is portrayed by actors, probably all of whom dislike Fox News, and every one of them voted against the who Roger voted for. It was, the main source in this was a PR guy who ended on very, very bad terms with Roger and hated him, and vice versa. I guess he hated him. It's said ugly things. I mean, this is almost like if you had the biography of Donald Trump told by the Clinton production company. And that's just a very bizarre thing. I mean, it's kind of like, that's what Hollywood is, and they get that power. So far in this episode, they haven't played that hand too ugly, in my opinion. And right now, and we'll talk about some of the nuances when we get to Roger's character. Right now, I don't want to say it's fair and balanced, but there was no like, oh, you frickin' Hollywood people. I haven't seen that at all so far.
It hasn't gotten heavy-handed yet, but something tells me it will.
Yeah. I mean, this is probably the establishment, and we had talked about Russell Crowe. Actually, gave some interviews out there where he's said some nice things about Roger. Now,
he said that people that he went to for information about Roger so that he could play the character better, many of them said, you know what, say what you will, we love that guy.
So that doesn't mean that this isn't the nice tune that they hum as they're walking you to the gallows, but there was some of that.
It's something along those lines, yeah.
Okay, so one character that I felt just was completely at odds with the real life, and it was pretty rare in this show actually, was Roger's personal assistant, or his primary secretary, Judy Laterza. So Judy Laterza in this movie is this kind of steely-eyed, I mean, she looks kind of a lot like her, but she's this steely-eyed, shooting shade at people, Beth needs a project, Roger, type of thing. And in the real world, the Judy Laterza was one of like the sweetest human beings on the planet. I mean, almost unbelievably so. And she would be like, oh, hi, how are you doing? She had this kind of little light sing-songy voice. I mean, she had an MBA. She was bright. She understood corporate politics. She got Rogers and all of that. She was wonderful. But absolutely nothing like this woman who's portraying her, except that she had a dog and they were both dark hair. That was the only one out of this where I'm like, you guys just kind of screwed the pooch on that.
Yeah, Judy was. Look, I know she knew a lot of Roger's secrets. I know that she was unfailingly loyal to him the whole time that certainly I knew them. Mm-hmm. But there was another side to her too. I mean, she would come into the office, my office, sometime, and just say, "I'd really like your advice on this." Well, there was probably a game being played here, right. But we all obeyed the rules, and I said what I thought she wanted to hear, and sometimes I actually gave her advice, and she was ever so grateful and kind, and remembered things, remembered my kids' birthdays.
Right.
She was an amazing woman.
She was very sweet, and I have not kept in touch with her enough, and I wish she should, or I wish I did. So the next one is somebody who, and look, I'll just get most of my personal biases out of here, was Brian Lewis, the PR guy played by, who's the comedian?
Seth MacFarlane.
I hate Brian Lewis. I think he is a smart, aggressive, probably helped Fox News grow, and I think he's just a very bad person, and I never liked him, and I still don't. He was the only senior executive, though, who was talking to Gabe Sherman throughout his writing of the book. So I'm just guessing that Brian Lewis will turn into a hero in this thing somehow. Somehow, Roger always said, if you want to find out who leaked a story, see who it said nice things about. That's the person who was the one who leaked it. And so I think Seth MacFarlane, you see him, he's kind of nasty, but it's always at the direction of Roger. I suspect he will have a soul. I suspect Hollywood-wise, he will have the arc. Roger will be the villain who goes, and Seth MacFarlane.
Crisis of conscience.
And I don't buy any of it. And Brian Lewis, if he got a conscience, it was probably the day after he was fired, but no doubts on mine. So we don't need to keep going into that unless you have anything to add.
No, I think that the funny part was when Roger walks into Brian's office as he's getting arranged and starting the new job at Fox, and you hear this incredibly loud rap music playing. That really was true.
He did play the loud music. Look,
he played it so loud, and his office was next to mine. And now you talk about Judy Laterza and how integral she was to things. I once asked Brian, I just said, look, dude, do you mind turning it down a little bit? And he said, yeah, sure. He didn't confront or he didn't say, go screw yourself, but he didn't turn it down either.
And then you probably read that you did something that you probably read a gossip columnist that said you were gay or something after that.
Yeah, whatever. And so I went to Judy and I just said, this is just intolerable. I can't hear myself complaining about the music. And finally it got turned down.
So that leads to the last character before Roger, and it was that really square guy, John Moody. So it was a really good-looking guy who played you. So that's always a positive thing in life, I guess.
Small blessings.
He had a handful of speaking roles. What was it like watching yourself being portrayed and say words that you either did or didn't say? And I don't know, what did you think of you?
Look, sort of like you, Ken, working for Roger Ailes was the highlight of my professional life. And he gave me an enormous amount of freedom to do the things that he knew I needed to do to make the news part of Fox successful. I've been asked so many times over the years, did he control you? Did he tell you what to do? Did he choose the stories? The answer is no. He trusted me for goodness knows what reason. He was tremendously inspirational, as you know. And so this, master pet thing that's being portrayed, I know it fits the narrative, but that's just not how it was.
Your guy was a little nerdy.
Guilty as charged.
So Roger always had a little bit, I found it interesting, although you had heard him call himself a newsman once, they kind of repeatedly referred to himself as that, and I had never heard him kind of want to be in that camp. From my point of view, Roger kind of like, he had the serious journalists, and sometimes he'd lower his voice and he wouldn't do the air quotes, but he'd say, "Oh yes, the journalists." And by that, he usually meant John Moody and Brit Hume. I mean, he kind of viewed you, and look, journalism has changed over the years, but back then, and you jump in and correct me anytime, it was somewhat of akin to a priesthood, that we put truth here, we put our values are separate here. You know, you can't arrest us for this, you can't ask us who we voted for. I mean, there was a little bit of a we're wrapping ourselves around in something that is a profession that matters. And again, I think this is a concept that is now kind of just blown up all over the place in America. But I always felt that Roger never considered himself a journalist.
No.
And you were like the journalist, and your kind of only other possible, sometimes equal, would have been Brit Hume because of your long history on that. And that he knew that he could influence you sometimes, but he also never. I mean, and it seemed like to me he would be like, "Ken, go do this, this, and this." And with the journalist, it seemed like he allowed them a little bit more flexibility.
Well, flexibility is one way of putting it. Nuance is maybe a better way, and that's what I fear this series is going to lack completely is nuance. Yeah, Roger understood that journalism, and people do say capital J journalism as though that's to be separated from the New York Post or something. But people did in the 90s and beginning of the 21st century did feel that journalism was a calling. And my only complaint is, too many people got into journalism to make the world a better place. I hated that. I hated when people came in looking for jobs, saying that's what we want to do. I usually didn't hire them. What you're supposed to do if you're a journalist is report accurately what you've learned and what you've seen. And that's a pretty simple thing. We've, as you alluded to,
it's all walks. It's all that's not going on a whole lot right now. I don't see in the world.
And it's not happening now. I mean, we gave in to our own worst instincts, and I mean that by we journalists. We started to think we were so important that we knew more than other people, and that we were going to show the world how to work. It's been terrible to see what's happened in the past 20 years, and so especially terrible to see what's happened since Trump has been president.
Yeah. Well, they're saving the world, and
they're saving the world. They're resisting. They're going to stop Donald Trump. It's not our job.
So the last character that we haven't talked about is the first character is Roger Ailes and Russell Crowe. My impression is that Russell Crowe's done some great parts of capturing parts of Roger, and the biggest chunk of Roger he completely whiffed on. Now, I don't know if that was intentional or he just didn't ever, he certainly never met him. I don't know if he met him. He had the look of him, great. Voice of him, not so much. Every once in a while, it's like, I'm looking at Roger, but I'm hearing Russell Crowe. What's going on? Okay, that's a hard thing. That's a hard thing to get down.
And every once in a while, a little down under gets into the voice.
Yeah. And Roger did not have an Australian accent. The biggest thing is look, the essence to me of so much of what Roger was. I mean, Roger was a lot of things, and he was somebody I did and do love, and he was infuriating sometimes, and he was captivating sometimes. He was one of the most inspirational persons I'd ever met in my life. People would talk about going in with a Steve Jobs and coming out, seeing the world differently, and then there was a reality distortion field. Roger had a bit of that. The one thing that I only saw just a couple small glimpses of, but Roger, if you put a camera at most of our meetings that we had with Roger, of which there were thousands, we could have had our own comedy channel. I mean, Roger could have killed it on the comedy circuit. He just said things in a funny way. He was always on a riff. He was one of the funniest people I had ever met in my life. I mean, Yeah, there was sometimes the screaming. There was him pressing. He was always had his foot on the gas, and he was inspiring and pushing people on. And even when you're beating the crap out of CNN, you left a meeting saying, "Oh my God, if we don't do this, we're going to lose. We got to get out there and work harder, and I got to get to work at 7." And Russell Crowe kind of had none of that. I saw his inspirational speeches were like kind of lame. It was like they weren't inspirational. There was never that twinkle in the eye of that Roger had. There was never the kind of humanity that Roger had. Crowe seems to go from being gruff to yelling, and interspersed with some sotto voce discussions with Beth on how he was screwing people over. And there was just kind of none of the part of Roger that to me was 70% of him, which was this inspirational figure who saw the world in black and white sometimes and was able to see around corners in the way, sometimes paranoid, sometimes mad, always pushing forward. And none of that came through in this movie at all. And to me, that's the biggest flat part of at least the first episode.
The first. I'm sure that this is going to devolve as the series unfolds. But what you saw was this fat guy who thought he could push people around, and Roger could have lost a few pounds, but he certainly never approached the job or his employees that way.
He was always the alpha dog, though. I mean, anybody who was like, there was nobody who was like, what, Roger, blah, 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 blah. I mean, he was always the guy in charge. I mean, he was a little bit more Tony Soprano than he was this guy here. I mean, you never kind of challenged him all that much. And we saw that a couple times in here.
Right. I can remember a couple of times when I'd go into his office and just say, I think you're wrong about this. Can we talk about it? He said, yeah, we can talk about it. And he was more complicated than this portrayal of him. That's
right.
For sure.
Yeah, I do remember.
Crowe has done an amazing job of looking like Roger, but he has not so far showed me that he is Roger.
Yeah. So the Tony Soprano thing is interesting because there are a lot of similarities between that portrayal of him and Roger, and again, a lot of it was in just kind of the alpha dog thing. I ask you. So do you program the Fox News channel? I know he asked one primetime host that who had said something out of school, and the guy was like, no, I don't, and I apologize, and moving on. But the biggest thing so a buddy of mine told me one of these stories, a buddy of mine who worked for Roger when I did in the 80s, in the political years, about how the Ailes Communications, before he was in news, did a communications project with a big nonprofit on the East Coast, and it was funded by the rich guy. It was an orchestra society. Okay, so we're talking type of things. And it was a new money guy who was worth a lot of dough, but he was new money and he was aggressive but he wanted to run this orchestra society, whereas they'd let him take his money and he'd be on the board, but he was trying to figure out why he couldn't. Well, Roger had people who interviewed all sorts of, and they were looking at the communication plan. And Roger figured out what the problem was, and he called this guy to a breakfast with the young aide who told me this story. And he said, so here's the problem. Everybody thinks you're an asshole. This kid here, he thinks you're an asshole. All of the other members of this board think you're an asshole. And I think they might be right. And the trick in that isn't being able to call somebody an asshole, because that's easy to do. But Roger could do that in a way that you knew he was on your side. You knew he was actually telling you something that even though it was tough to hear and sometimes blatantly hard to hear, he looked at me once when I introduced him to my friends and said, Ken, I didn't think you had any friends. And he was saying, don't be quite as edgy as you are around the office. And the ability for somebody to do that, and you're like, thank you. Because I kind of always thought I was an asshole, but I really wasn't sure. And now you're telling me how to get that forward. That was one of the geniuses of Roger Ailes. You've had some stories like that.
Yeah, he wasn't just making the accusation. He wasn't just making the statement. He was also giving you a way out. And I think what we saw in the first episode during the rehearsals when Sean Hannity put on a terrible performance, and Roger is supposedly looking through from the control room. And he goes out afterward, and Sean, the character playing Sean, says, "Roger, I'm sorry, that was terrible." And Roger, with a smile and a laugh, says, "Yeah, it was."
That was one of the more realistic scenes that I saw in there, because I was like, that's Roger.
Right, because he knew how to fix the problem without ruining the person he was dealing with. He needed Sean. He wanted Sean to succeed, and he basically gave him a roadmap to be...
And he told him, be yourself, you've got that talent,
Yeah.
just do it. That was so typical Roger Ailes, and it was the way you acted, the way you appeared on TV. How often would he call a host up and say, "You're actually you're an interviewer. Can you let the other person talk?" and he was right.
one time we were, some of these rehearsals were truly abysmal, and 2 days before we launched, a Peruvian airliner crashed into the Pacific Ocean, and 70 people or something were killed. And we were still in rehearsal mode, but doing it in real time, so that the anchors had to be seeing up-to-date news. It wasn't going out anywhere, but it was real time. And so there was a man and a woman on the same set, and we were trying to do this tag team thing. And the guy says, and now we've learned that a Peruvian airliner has plummeted into the Pacific Ocean, killing all aboard. And the woman on screen with him just goes, "That's too bad." and so I had to go down and tell her, look, don't do stuff like that. That's not what we're here for. And I went up to Roger and I said, we had a terrible performance. And this woman heard about an air crash and said, "That's too bad." And Roger just looked at me and goes, "What, you think it was good?"
It's the problem with you journalists. You had to be on both sides, but you had to be on the Pacific Ocean side instead of the Peruvian airliner side.
What's the matter? Don't you have blood in those veins, Moody? Yeah.
All right, so that first episode ends with the launch of the Fox News Channel. What do you remember from that? Besides the fact that Roger was never in the control room, and that's a little poetic license.
Roger
I got
was never
it.
in the control room, and
He called it a lot though. He had a phone to it, right?
Oh, he had a red phone. I mean, he didn't have to dial anything. He picked it up and it rang in the control room.
I want a red phone.
Ken, one of the things, the preparations for this launch, and I understand that there have to be some Hollywood aspects to it all, but, I kept a diary all the time. I kept a diary every year that I worked at Fox, and I have literally a handwritten note from his assistant, not Judy Laterza, but another assistant, informing me of the famous 4 a.m. meeting.
Right.
Now, I took that pretty seriously, and I made sure that I got a hotel room in New York for the night before, and I set the hotel alarm clock, I set my watch, I set, asked for coffee to be delivered at 3 o'clock and a phone call, because I wasn't going to miss that meeting.
Because he let you know anybody who was late had a little bit of a problem, right?
He left no doubt that he was serious and that there was no room for error.
And you'd be fired if you were late.
Yeah, but in a way, that was a microcosm of how he was going to run Fox News. I told you to do something, do it.
Right.
And so yeah, there was one poor guy that came in late, and that was his last day of employment. And
ironically, that was also a guy Roger wanted to kill from the beginning, right?
He wasn't crazy about this guy to start with, so this was,
So it was a perfect example. So when the loser guy that you don't like is popping up here and comes in late, you're like, this is a win-win.
That meeting, sorry, don't know how many other people will remember, but he didn't yell. There was no shouting and screaming.
Right.
It was, now look, guys, we're doing a really bad job of getting ready for this.
Now this was what, a week before launch?
It was 2 days, about 2-3 days before launch.
Okay.
Yeah, but it was the way he shifted the burden from the mistakes that were being made off of us and asked the question, what are you, particularly, John Moody, Bill Shine, this and that, Brian Lewis, what are you going to do to improve this?
Now, he had advice for you, if I recall. What did he tell you to do?
He told me to go write every script myself.
And you,
I don't like the scripts. You're supposed to be a good writer. Why don't you write them all yourself? Oh, thanks a lot.
it's a 24-hour news channel, boss.
Yeah, exactly. 168 hours a week. So, but he managed to make you ask yourself, what can I do better? And that's the definition of teamwork.
See, that was what I always, look, I learned a lot of lessons from him. The toughest one was, how do you keep people motivated when everything's going great? 2 days before launch, it's easier. Hey, the cameras are, you had a guy out there who said we shouldn't launch, right? Didn't the head tech person
too
say?
Early, we couldn't possibly be ready.
That probably wasn't well received, I'm guessing.
That didn't go down well.
But where Roger's real genius came, 10 years later, when we're making more money than Rupert could figure out how to spend, when you're 50% higher ratings on CNN, and he'd have you coming out of those meetings pumped up, ready to fight, because you had to keep an eye on your back because they were catching up to us and we're going to lose. And if Fox News goes down, that whole concept of what we offer goes down, and America goes a different direction, and it's cats sleeping with dogs and everything
Look,
is bad.
He made the stakes very clear to everybody, and what he never said was, if you don't do this, I won't look good. That wasn't his point. His point was, we're all going to fail together in this.
So I saw one review on this by some weenie at Daily Beast who was like, oh, they were too nice on Roger and this and that. And he talked about the sycophants and the enablers and all this, and how could they, and it was, yeah, he's entitled to his own opinion. It was just all stupid in the sense that he just kind of had no. If you view Fox News from the outside of like a Gabe Sherman or the Daily Beast people who just think it's some weird dystopian thing under there where we were all digging our shovels and being beaten by the fat guy, it's just like so completely at odds with any reality that I had for however many years that I was there for.
Yeah, it's all that, beatings will continue until morale improves. That's not how Roger acted. He was...
It's funny, he yelled a lot, but he was always yelling at somebody who, or how do I say?
Well, that's the other thing, Ken. That portrayal in the control room, completely unlike Roger. He did not yell. He did not yell at sound engineers or assistant producers or production assistants. He yelled at executives. And then he said, now you get down there and tell them to fix this. Or he yelled at talent because he knew that they were secure enough in their positions, of Bill O'Reilly or something like that. And he was having real serious arguments with them. But he didn't, I hate to say it this way, he didn't yell at the little people.
It's probably true. That's probably true. Although, interestingly, he always had a lot of connections with people deep down into the, he'd walk and there'd be an editor who he'd just strike up a conversation with. And I think he did that as much as to check morale all the time. It was also, he did that way to check the executives. And sometimes, when I took over the West Coast of Fox News, I did that as well. I spent a day hanging out with the truck operators and figuring out how are you in a big satellite and how do you hit the bird? How do you get onto a satellite? And how long does that take? And you learn little things like that. You learn what they're thinking. And I saw Roger screw over a couple executives who were like, well, no, this doesn't work that way. And he knew something about their department that they didn't, and was like, well, it actually does, doesn't it? And why didn't you do the confabulator? I don't know, not a great example, but I saw that a handful of times too, which was interesting.
Yeah. So I can't wait for the next show. It's I think things get darker pretty quickly.
Yeah, again, he's gonna be the villain. I'm still predicting who will be a hero in there, which we're going to start drinking on these sets over the next six episodes. All right, that is it. I hope people enjoyed watching this. If you do, this is our very first video that we've done at LaCorte News. Do all the likes and followings and subscribings and all that stuff on YouTube. It's our very first video here, and we will see you next week.
And check out LaCorte News.
Yeah, if you have some time. All right, bye-bye.